So thank you for joining me this evening. Hopefully you've all had a good day, but whatever day you've had, hopefully you can relax into this evening's session. The session will be about an hour, so it might go a little bit longer than that, just depends on how many questions we get, but that's kind of the aim. So just by way of introduction, my name is Aliya. I'm a registered nutritionist and I've been a freelance nutritionist since 2011. I worked in the voluntary sector and NHS before that, but my practice covers things like training. So I was delivering training this morning in one-to-one consultations. I also do one-to-ones and workshops, do some business consultancy. So a wide range of things. So hopefully things that I'll bring to you this evening will give you a flavour of that. Why this session? So first of all, sorry, we've got some tech issues with the chat. Let me just delete this. First of all, the new standards came in kind of quite quietly, so not everyone was aware of them. But also, because I provide supervision for quite a few different people, we decided that it was good to talk about these to make sure we all comply, but also to make sure I don't have to repeat myself lots and lots of times. I'm going to do it for this evening for all those I supervise, and I've added that option for other people to join in. So if I don't supervise you, you're very welcome as well. After the session, those that I do supervise have the option to stay on and have some networking time in breakout rooms. So please, those of you who I don't supervise, if you leave at the end, and then we'll sort those breakout rooms out for everybody else. So without further chatting, I will go into the standards. So as I mentioned, there's quite a lot of you on this evening, so if you can remain on mute, that would be really helpful. If you've got questions, pop them in the chat. I have a trusted co-host who is going to help me field the questions at the end, and I will come to them. I will come to as many questions as I can, but they will be limited to the ones specifically around the practice in terms of the standards. I'm not going to answer questions on all sorts of topics this evening, just in the interest of time. So the learning outcomes for this session are to understand the new independent practice standards, and to identify any learning or action which needs to come in order to comply with those standards. As I said, they start on the 1st of July, so we haven't got very long to comply. I'm not an AfN member of staff. I don't have insider AfN knowledge. So this session is purely based on the standards that are readily available on the website. The AfN do know that I'm running this session though. So as a disclaimer, you do need to still read the standards, even having attended this session. Hopefully you'll understand them as a result of the session, but that is your responsibility as an AfN registrar to comply. For the more experienced Nutri in the room, people who've been freelance for a long time, hopefully this session will just be a reminder that you are doing things right, but hopefully you'll also get something out of it as well. So for those who are less experienced, there might be things in here that you aren't doing or not aware of, and hopefully that will help you comply by the 1st of July. So what is independent practice and freelance practice? As defined by the standards, it's providing services in a paid or unpaid capacity where nutrition-related activities are undertaken with no direct supervision, guidance or support. Key to note is the paid or unpaid capacity. Often we focus on the paid work, particularly new graduates often take on voluntary work. And I've had so many conversations with people, I don't need insurance, it's just voluntary, I'm not getting paid for it, so it doesn't matter. Actually, the standards are very clear on this. It's paid or unpaid. And it might be that you're working independently as a freelancer, or it might be that you're working for a business, for a charity, for a gym, but you're the only nutrition professional in that space. So I've supervised people who work in all sorts of different places over the years. Some of them work in big organisations, but if they are the only nutritionist, then they need that supervision, and these standards apply to them as well. So it's, as I said, paid or unpaid. It's employed either independently of other nutrition professionals, or you're self-employed, or you're giving independent advice on a voluntary in a voluntary capacity. Also applies, this is another common misconception of freelancing, I think, because lots of people think one-to-ones when they think freelance, but actually freelancers do a whole range of things, and there's some people in the room who do a whole range of other things to the things I do, but you can be working directly with the public or with business clients, so that also comes under all this independent practice standard. And it can be face-to-face services, online services, written communications, what you put on social media. It can be consultation, so it could be you're running a consultation with a client one-to-one on a public health issue, whether that's a nutritional deficiency or weight management, whatever. But it could also be you're working with a business on their legislation compliance, or their packaging or their communications. So it's not just members of the public, and it applies to group settings as well. So a whole range of different things that these standards comply to. They really tried to get everybody in on these and these standards. And AfN is a registered charity. It's there to protect the public. So that's what this is for, to protect the public. It's obviously for the benefit of us in terms of keeping the integrity of the profession, but it is really there to protect the public. So what are the consequences of not following the standards? The standards state that if something ever goes wrong, you, as in the business or personal client, can be reassured that anyone can raise a concern through the fitness to practice process, and that's on the AfN website. That AfN will take the concern seriously, and they'll take action when these identify a serious issue regarding a registrant's knowledge, understanding, skills or behaviour. So if you don't comply with the standards, then potentially you could lose your registration in extreme circumstances, or you could be sanctioned. Also, there are certain things in the standards that are legal requirements, so there's obviously ramifications if you don't follow that side of it as well, not just from an AfN perspective, but from British law perspective. Also in the standards, it says that there's going to be some way of saying that you comply with the standards. So you will be ticking a box that says, I offer freelance services, paid or unpaid, and I'm complying with the standard. I checked earlier, it's still not there, but it may appear. So keep checking back on it. Just as a free tip, that the register changes on a regular basis. Virtually every time I go on there, there's another box of some service that I haven't ticked that actually I have got experience in and I can offer that service, or there's another area that you can kind of focus on. So if you're offering a wide range of services, make sure you're checking in regularly to see what extra thing they've added in. They added in pregnancy in the last few weeks, seemingly. So, if you deal with pregnant women, then tick that box. So make sure you're up to date in that respect. The standards obviously are saying you've got to tick that box. So assuming AfN get that sorted fairly soon, and just check back and make sure you're having that free advertising. Let's go into the standards now in more depth. So there are 3 standards, and we're going to take each one in turn. I'll tell you what the AfN standards actually say, and then I'll give you some kind of a bit more information about the sorts of things that might fit under that standard. The first one is adhere to legal requirements. Now, I'm not a legal expert, so it's important that you get legal advice on your business practice, but some things to think about from my own experience and my experience of helping others set up in business practice. So AfN says in their standards, you are personally responsible. So this applies in business generally. Under law, you are responsible for your own actions. And they also say you've got to demonstrate safe and professional practice through understanding and adhering to legal requirements and procedures. Excuse me. So let me unpack these a bit. The standards do go in a little bit more detail. Where it's in speech marks, that's directly from the standards, and then the other bits are some explanation that I've added in. So firstly, to achieve this, you must ensure appropriate business policies and procedures for the gathering and storage of data, privacy and complaints, adhering to relevant regulations such as data protection, GDPR, and make sure that those are complied with. I'm just going to remove the box. Some of the things to think about when it comes to legal requirements. So first of all, the Information Commissioner's Office, if you're holding any personal data, you need to be registered with the Information Commissioner's Office. And if you're not sure, check on their website. It's got details of who needs to register. And there is a small fee each year to register with them. They are the kind of data regulator within the UK. If you're working outside of the UK, then you need to register, be aware of the requirements of those other areas. And I should have said at the beginning, these are all UK recommendations, although the standards apply to all AfN registrants. In the main AfN standards, it talks about having a complaints policy. That is also recommended for this bit. So having a complaints policy on your website. There are templates freely available online, so don't feel like you've got to come up with your own completely. Always in the complaints policy, you should have something that links back to the AfN fitness to practice, because that's our kind of ombudsman, if you like, for where you would take it if you hadn't dealt with the client's issues yourself. Then think about employer and volunteer health and safety. So I get asked a lot if people can come and watch what I'm doing, come and help me with what I'm doing, which is lovely. It's nice that people want to do it, but I need to make sure that they are safe. So whether that's insurance or the other procedures that you have in place, you need to do that before you have students come and help you. I don't have that insurance, so I don't have students coming and to what I do, unfortunately. That is something that we would need to consider. Risk assessments. So if you've got a certain number of people working for you, and that includes volunteers, then you legally have to do a risk assessment. But it's generally good practice to do a risk assessment, and that's a physical risk assessment. So things like falling over stuff and whether someone's going to have pictures off the wall and hurt themselves, or if you're doing cooking sessions. So they're a lot more complicated. There are templates on the Health and Safety Executive website. You also need to consider things like online risk if you're doing online sessions, which is why I got you all to name yourselves before you came in, because that's a risk. And then safeguarding. Safeguarding has got so much tighter in a good way, but it's more difficult to navigate as a freelancer. So not just those working with children need to have safeguarding policies and training to comply, but also to keep our clients safe and act in the best interests of clients, which is that #1 standard in the main standards. Then things like equal opportunities, which is a legal requirement, and making sure you're registered for tax and national insurance, and the dreaded IR35 if you're working for companies. If you're for tax purposes, you need to know whether you're like an employee, or you're a freelancer. And there are questions online. If you Google IR35 and look at the gov.uk website, it'll tell you whether you are under those laws or not. They are quite complicated if you get stuck in the loop, but it's basically whether you can be replaced and whether you can set your own hours and things like that kind of come into that. This is not an exhaustive list, and it's important to keep on top of legal requirements. Networks like Sense, which is all nutritionists and dietitians, or business networks where people keep you up to date with the latest developments, are really helpful for this sort of thing. Also, to achieve this, we look at business contracts. So the AfN's standards say any business contracts you have responsibility for need to comply with legal requirements, and you're aware of legal documents and responsibilities such as non-disclosure agreements, understanding the implications of signing or breaching such documents, and identifying when you should seek legal support. So those contracts, obviously, I'm not a legal expert, I've said that already, so make sure that the contracts that you've got do comply. There are templates available that will enable you to have the kind of broad spectrum information for legal requirements and contracts. However, just bear in mind that there are certain things that are helpful for nutritionists to consider in contracts. Things like use of your name, or whether there's a break clause that says that if they do something that's against AfN standards, that you're able to get out of it, or because obviously that's not a legal requirement, slightly different. Things like use of your photo, use of materials, and all the regulations around health, nutrition and health claims, and the use of your name alongside that. You need to make sure you comply with all that legislation as well. I've not got time to go into all of that, and I'm not a legal expert in that, but also the legislation around health claims is complex, and so yeah, you need more training on that if you're working in that field. Also, to achieve this, talks about insurance, so appropriate insurance in place. I mentioned already employer's insurance, that the insurance also applies to you, so liability and professional indemnity insurance. Depending on what you're doing, you may want to have cyber insurance, medical malpractice, contents insurance. There's a whole host of insurance. I would recommend speaking to an insurance broker to find out what's really necessary based on the work that you're doing, and making sure that you tell them exactly what you're doing. Also tell them if you change what you're doing. You get to discover some new service that you want to run, and you forget to tell your insurer that you might end up not insured for that bit that you started doing. And then within the insurance, risk assessments may be a requirement of your insurance, and the record keeping associated with that. So depending on your insurer, they may ask you to keep records for 3 years, 5 years. Some would say even longer than that. So it's worth checking with your insurer how long, and also think about whether you need to keep records for your CPD as well. So that's a sort of side issue, but in terms of your records, you need to work out what your policies are so that you can say that under GDPR legislation. And then also think about if you're working, so I've met this all kind of freelance, to think about insurance in some ways. There may be companies that you work for or charities that you work for who haven't considered particularly professional indemnity insurance. So when I worked for a charity first out of uni, I paid my own professional indemnity insurance because they were not covering that. I was the only nutritionist working there. They were fine with public liability, but they just had no concept of what professional indemnity was. So just make sure you are covered for that. Professional indemnity insurance is to do with causing harm because of the advice you give. And that obviously can be print as well as verbal advice. Whereas public liability is kind of the physical damage to property, and so you may not need public liability if you're working solely online, but it just depends on I'm not going to say you definitely don't, because it depends on your situation. The other side of the risk in this area is to think about sole trader or limited company, and that's a wider discussion you need to have potentially with a business advisor about what would work for you, or within a network that people from different experiences can share that benefit. The main difference between the two is where the liability lies. Although I should say with the AfN standards, even if you're working for a limited company, you're solely responsible for complying with the standards. The second standard is around communicating and consulting appropriately. And this is around that general communication. So the public clients and businesses benefit from communication delivered effectively and appropriately regarding the services provided by independent freelance registrants. No, I don't think anyone would argue with that one. And so we are required to conduct client and business communications and consultations professionally and ethically. So we need to think more broadly about communication. So in order to achieve this, we need to use language and communication styles appropriate to the business setting and platform. It's going to really vary depending on who your client group is, but really be careful to proofread and think about plain English. So proofreading, if your English isn't your first language, or if you're just rushing, it's really easy to make mistakes, and sometimes autocorrect is not your friend. So just be careful to proofread what you're doing. It might sound obvious, but I think we can all be reminded of that. And then plain English. So we have a tendency as health professionals to make things overcomplicated. If your audience is not scientists and other health professionals, then the language that we use needs to be kind of 7-8-year-old reading level. So just trying to kind of bring it down a level or a few levels to be able to be easily understood is important. We also need to consider how we present our information. So presenting in a suitable format and communication media. I'm going to come on to social media in a minute, but we must be really careful to give the whole picture. Sometimes we can give a little bit of the picture, and then people don't get that full picture. So I'll give an example. I mentioned that in my one-to-one training, I once spoke to a client about the benefits of oats. The next consultation, he very proudly said to me that he was having oats for breakfast, lunch and dinner. I hadn't given him the full picture about the fact that it wasn't just oats he needed to eat, and they were part of a balanced diet. It might sound like an obvious thing to do, but we need to give that whole picture and make sure people have understood very clearly what we've said. And so the benefit of a follow-up appointment was clear there. The other thing about kind of the way we're communicating is to try and avoid political bias or racial bias, and we are all biased. I think if anyone says that they're not, they are. There's no way around it. We need to kind of understand our bias and try and perhaps get some input from somebody else to see whether there's a way around it. But yeah, just being aware of that bias and try and be as objective as you possibly can. The next one continues in the same vein. Sorry, I missed this one again. So this is social media. You may recognise this, but sorry, I'm just a tech issue. Hold on a second. The AF Nutra chat group came up with this, and it's really helpful. It's very small on the screen, but I've broken it down into some other slides to kind of look at the different sections. So the first bit of it looks about being proud of your profession, clear on who you are and knowing your limits. So we're trying to kind of promote AfN in the way we communicate. This is all around social media, but actually it applies to everything, which is why I've put it in. So being consistent about our titles, it is an AfN main standard to make sure you use your correct title. So if you say you're R Nutra and you're actually A Nutra or whatever, that you're not complying with the standards. Be clear on who you are, so you're building that trust, and then kind of explaining that you're a registered nutritionist and you're registered with AfN. Unfortunately, lots of people now are saying they're registered nutritionists and they're not AfN registered. So we need to be even more clear about what we do. And then making sure we know our scope of practice. And obviously there are certain things that are scope of practice for A Nutra, R Nutra as a whole, you know, that we are not supposed to prescribe, treat or diagnose unless we're medical professionals as well. However, there are some things obviously that scope of practice means that individuals' scope of practice is going to be different from another. For example, sports nutrition is outside my scope of practice because I just don't know enough about it. Being polite and respectful. I know there's a big debate on at the moment about ultra processed food, isn't there? Trying to be polite and respectful about other people's opinions is really, really important. So that kind of comes into the communicating effectively, and would come onto these standards and the other standards. Making sure your pictures are legal, so that you've asked for permission. Also, if you are doing any product promotion, those pictures can come under the legislation around health claims. So just be careful with your pictures, and just think about what you're posting. And then bottom, about promoting products and brands, as the Advertising Standards Authority has guidance on how you do this well. There's also the brand guidance from AfN directly that may be helpful for those of you doing brand promotion. There is a line in the other standards that talks about when you're promoting a product, you should always say that other products are available. So if whether you're doing one-to-one consultations, just general social media, or you're promoting specific products, it's important that you read that section in the main standards. And the last bit of the professionalism around social media is being mindful of privacy. So just be aware that you're sharing this stuff with the world, and you've got to be careful with confidentiality, but also you need to be careful with your own safety, and supporting your colleagues. So that's what we will all aim to do, is to support our colleagues to help build the profession. So further in the communicate and consult appropriately, we need to market our services appropriately, professionally and ethically, in line with the main standards, so the AfN standards of ethics, conduct and performance. I've mentioned those ASA guidelines and the health, nutrition and health claims as examples, but it goes broader than that. Design and plan appropriate client consultations. So this would be, obviously, I've mentioned business or one-to-one consultations with members of the public, including structure, required paperwork, resource provision, and appropriate software platforms and technology. So there's obviously lots of stuff around GDPR that I mentioned earlier, vetting consent, and having an audit trail for that, having justification for why you're asking different questions, and then the NICE guidance on use of digital technology is another source of information that might be helpful in this area, but it's about trying to justify what we're doing, and make sure we've got all our ducks in a row with this. If this is something that you struggle with, maybe this is something that you need extra training on, and to make sure that you've thought through the whole process of how you do consultations, and so having someone who's a little bit further along than you in the journey that you're in the same field. Obviously, we're all in nutrition, but in the same kind of part of nutrition can be helpful for that. We'll come on to that in a bit as well, in terms of having a network. And then the other side of communication, thinking about managing client expectations. So again, not just one-to-one consultations, but clients who are perhaps businesses, or they could be kind of workshop commissioners. So thinking through, just put a few different things down. Costs, massive headache as a freelancer is having to decide what the costs are going to be, but being clear about what your costs are right at the beginning. That's good for you and good for them. Be clear about what's included. So the number of times, I mean, I'm still learning on this, but the number of times you think, well, actually, I should have thought through how much work was involved with this, or the extras that, you know, the admin that's required, the invoicing that's required, the extra training, lots of things kind of come into that. So think about what's included. If you're doing one-to-one consultations, can people email you afterwards? And all of that. The timeframes, when you're going to get things back, and the kind of parameters of your work. So if you're doing work in a health setting where you might get asked questions about a health condition, what are the parameters that you would have to stick to? And within that, the kind of limitations of your work, or the limitations of the work that you produce. So for example, you might produce a leaflet based on current guidance, but the limitation of it is it may need updating, or it will need updating, and how long that might be. So lots of things to kind of think about in that, managing client expectations, and it varies from service to service. I've mentioned some of these already, so we're kind of reiterating this, but collaborating effectively, ethically, including but not limited to with health and medical professionals, and in brand sponsorship and influencer activities. If you haven't read the Working with Brands guidelines, I'd recommend doing that. And then I've also mentioned about the AfN standards already, excuse me, in terms of recommending a particular product. We always have to say there's an alternative, which can be difficult if you're working with a product you feel like there isn't an alternative, but you've got to comply with the standards somehow. And then having appropriate professional networks to allow for collaboration and onward referrals. So networking with other people is so important for our own development, and for the benefit of the public. The final bit of communicating effectively is thinking about behaviour change. And obviously this, you might think, well, this applies just to people who are doing one-to-one consultations. To a certain extent it does, but it also applies if you're doing wider literature around health promotion. This all comes into that too. So we've got to use appropriate behaviour change methods and interpersonal skills. They've listed some, and then supported clients with setting and agreeing realistic goals. So they've got some examples of that as well. It's not just about giving a diet plan. For those of you who've done my training, you'll know that we talk about this in a lot more detail, but the communication around, we know this information, we're going to share this information with you, is not going to change behaviour. So we actually need to work with the clients to break down their barriers, or help them break down their barriers, should I say. So if you feel like you haven't had enough behaviour change training at university, that's something to consider. As I said, it's not just one-to-one consultations. When you're doing a poster for a GP practice wall, or a display board, that also applies, or a big public health campaign, it also applies. The third part is around reflecting, evaluating and supporting. So nutritionists I'm not sure exactly where the information about this came from, but you can kind of understand where they're coming from when they say this. Nutritionists practicing independently or in a freelance capacity are less likely to have regular contact or support from other nutrition professionals. Hopefully, that in some ways that is the case, and people who are working with other nutrition professionals should get support. Some organisations they don't get as much support, but this is where AfN have decided that we as freelancers or those working in independent practice need that extra reminder to have the network in place. So therefore, it's important to regularly undertake continuing professional development activities. I would argue that's the same whether you work independently or not, but that's what's in the standards, and that we demonstrate regular reflection, evaluation, and development of professional practice and competence. So the standard is 30 hours. There are changes happening to kind of make sure this is really clear in the ANUTRA. At the moment, it's not actually written down that the ANUTRA have to do 30 hours, but that is about to change. The ANUTRA are supposed to be doing their portfolio development, so would have probably at least 30 hours based on the experience I've had with ANUTRA. But we're looking specifically in CPD to have some CPD for depth, so working in the area that you are currently working, going deeper with your knowledge. Some for breadth, which kind of broadens your horizons around nutrition. So, for example, you might do some CPD in sports nutrition or nutrition in industry if you're working in public health, or the other way around. So you've got a broader understanding of the food profession. And then we will also do some CPD on future prospects. So if you want to develop your scope of practice and broaden that to include something else, or you're developing a new service, then you need to do some further CPD around that area. That's where the future prospects bit comes from. So AfN suggest all three. So it's not just we're doing more in the area that we're currently working, it's having that breadth and the future prospects as well. So we can help each other by reminding each other of that and pointing each other to different things, particularly if you're working in one particular area. It may be helpful to have someone else from another area say, if you fancy coming along and doing something with me, so that you broaden that out. And CPD can be things that are not just webinars. We've been so fortunate in the last few years to have webinars coming out of our ears. Perhaps too many webinars, you could argue, but we can miss out on the other CPD, the reading, the work shadowing, the sitting on a committee, all counts as CPD. There's a whole load of stuff. And then once you've done the CPD, we need to apply reflective practice. And I've just put a table in the bottom, which is actually taken from a document that was on the AfN website. Don't ask me where on the AfN website it is now. I can't find it, but it was on the AfN website before they relaunched it. And it's just a simple table that helps with that reflection. You can also use the online tool to upload your CPD. You can use whatever format you want. The crucial thing is that we are reflecting and that we're updating risk assessments, we're working alongside new guidelines, and we're reviewing the activities to make sure our practice is up to date. Because the AfN standard for this is apply reflective practice to your activities, auditing and amending your own practice to manage risk and improve output. So it's very deliberate why you're doing CPD, not just for interest. It's actually to develop our practice in this. So if you were to read some nice guidance, for example, you might update your protocols. If you read some new evidence on a specific nutrient, you might update your fact sheets. And that's what this is talking about specifically. And, you know, when GDPR came in, a whole load of us were trying to frantically do CPD to update all our documents around to make sure we were GDPR compliant. And then the last bit of reflecting is about establishing support systems. So who do you go to? If you're an RNutra, then there's no requirement to have supervision or mentoring. At the moment, the AfN requirement for a Nutra, if you're working independently, is with clients, is to have supervision in place. Whether you call it supervision or mentoring is a bit debatable, but you know, that's requirement is not there for RNutra, but peer support is really helpful. And I don't know about you, but I've found chats with other freelancers to be really fruitful when it comes to trying to just bounce ideas off each other, and to make sure I'm keeping it to date. So that's why I've underlined that all career stages and experience levels. It's not that once you've got to RNutra, you know everything, and we still need that support system in place. The AfN have said in the past that the people without support tend to be the ones who end up in fitness to practice disputes. This is not just in AfN, but this is broader than that. So the support hopefully will help you be compliant with all the things that you've got to be compliant with. Just perhaps reflect on who you would go to, or who do you go to on a regular basis to reflect with, and see where you're going next. So having considered the new standards, I've given you a whistle-stop tour of the new standards. What happens next? So the 1st of July is not very far away. That's when the standards come in. Thinking about what you've learnt this evening, is there anything that you think I need to get sorted? Because it may be that I've said something, I don't have a complaints policy, or don't have a risk assessment, or I need to go and find out more information about that, or I need someone to think through with. Have a think. I'm just going to pause for a minute because I've talked at you for quite a while. Just going to pause for a minute to allow you just time to reflect on what you've heard, and think whether there's anything else you need to do in the next week and a half to comply. And then we'll go to questions.
I've got a question, Ali, already.
If you can stay on mute, if you can stay on mute, it'd be really helpful, and then I'll come to questions at the end. Thank you. Hey, I've not given you very long to think about it, but I know some people are really scared of awkward silences, so I'm going to move on. But it's important to reflect. So I've just put some further training thoughts there. If you wanted to do further training with me, and you don't have to, this is not a sales session. That wasn't the purpose of tonight. But I do have support for setting up a nutrition consultancy if that's where you're at. So that's a package that has a step-by-step guide and time with me to problem solve and ask loads and loads of questions. I delivered one-to-one consultations training yesterday and today, so the next one will be in the autumn, and I haven't set a date for that one or the nutrition workshops training yet, but if you'd like to get more details, then feel free to drop me a message. The details of the services that I provide are all there, so yeah, feel free to get in touch. I'll also send you an email with the slides from today, so that you've got those, and you'll have a link in there too. These are the two documents I've talked about. So the new standards, it is on the AfN website, but it's kind of buried in the news section, and then the old existing, should I say, not old standards, that these haven't replaced those standards, the main standards that we're all supposed to comply with, and anyone who's not working in freelance practice also has to comply with those other standards as well. So we've got time for questions. There's an evaluation link which we're going to pop in the chat. If you could complete the evaluation form, that would be really helpful. And that also gives you the opportunity to say whether there are things that you've got questions about, and I can follow those up with you, probably be next week. Also, a shameless plug, I've been nominated, thanks to Zoe Griffiths, for Community Nutrition Professional of the Year for the second time this year, and the voting is open. There's a whole host of different things you can vote for in terms of different categories, and we'll also pop the link in the chat. It's on the slide, but we'll pop the link in the chat as well. So try and champion the registered nutritionists on there if you can. Zoe's also, I nominated Zoe for the social media work she does, so a plug for her too. So there's two links coming in the chat now, and the link, sorry, 3 links, then the link to my website with details of the support that I provide. Right, so we're going to try and go to questions now. If we can stay on mute, that would be really helpful just for the recording, and I will look in the chat for questions and try and answer as many as I can in the time. So pop them in there. Just going to try and pop them. Okay. So I'll read out the question so you've got it, because obviously they just came to us. So if working in an organisation such as a local authority, which already has working practices, complies with GDPR, etc., does that cover it? Yes. So if you're complying with GDPR within the organisation that you're in, and they have a data controller and you've done the training, then as long as you are complying with GDPR, then yes, that would cover this requirement. If you're doing work outside of your existing job within a local authority, then you would need your own procedures to do that. So it just depends whether you're doing voluntary work or paid work outside of that remit. So it needs to be very clearly in your job description, the work you were doing to comply. Okay. What are the ASA guidelines and where can I find them? So if you look on the Advertising Standards Authority website, you will find the guidelines on there. That's answer to that question. And do you know if we ought to have a DBS check for online or in-person consultations? If so, at what level? So DBS checks are difficult because as an individual, you can't ask for a DBS check. As a freelancer, you can go through third-party organisations to get a DBS check. Essentially, a DBS check is telling you whether the person who's having the DBS check done has a criminal record or not. You would know whether you had a criminal record or not. So it depends on whether you think you've been told you need it for the employment that you're doing, whatever that might be. So, for example, if you're volunteering for a charity, then they may require you to have a DBS check before you start volunteering, because they need to validate that you haven't got a criminal record. That would mean that you couldn't work with vulnerable adults or children more generally. And so the level would depend on the work that you're doing. So you need to seek advice about the type of work you're doing. If you're just doing work with one-to-one clients, or you're doing work with businesses, you don't necessarily need to have a DBS check. But I would speak to someone within social services about what's required for your type of work. You can phone social services and their safeguarding board and ask a hypothetical question, and so they may be able to guide you in terms of where to get that support and what you would need. Hopefully that's answered that question. Please can give some more information on the need to register at the Information Commissioner's office. So the Information Commissioner's office is it's a very simple online form that you fill in. I think it's £35 to register with them. If you pay by direct debit, I think it's 40 if you don't. Anyone who holds personal data about anybody in the UK that's not personal, you know, you don't have to register as to hold your friend's information, but if it's in terms of a business or a charity, would need to be registered. There are some exemptions, so check on the Information Commissioner's Office website. ICO is the website to see whether you would need to comply with that registration. Are there changes to competencies? I've completed my portfolio and working on the evidences and supporting statement. In this case, I'd like to know if the new competency, so the new competency that's outside of the scope of this session, there are new competencies that come in next March or April. Yeah, the old competencies are up till the end of March, and then the next ones come in beginning of April. So if you're currently doing a portfolio, get it in by the end of March and you'll be fine. If you're delaying it and you don't need to delay it, i.e. you're able to transfer now, do it now. Extra incentive to get it done. Safeguarding training, again, I can't comment on specific providers, but if you search safeguarding, there's a whole load of different providers that you can do safeguarding training with. Yeah, you probably have to pay for it depending on what you're doing. The other way of doing safeguarding training is if you genuinely want to volunteer with an organisation, they'll probably send you on safeguarding training, so you could do it through them. I wouldn't recommend using an organisation just to do their safeguarding training, but if you genuinely want to benefit them, then might be something you could do the safeguarding training for. And if you provide consultancy services for an organisation rather than working with individuals, oops, it moved, and have a contract in place, could that be used to cover some of the requirements of point 1 related to complaints policy safeguarding? So if it depends whether you're considered an employee of that organisation. The contract, if you are an individual with the contract, then you would be required to do that. If the organisation has complaints procedures and you are an employee of that organisation, that's different. This complaints policy safeguarding applies to you as a freelancer or an individual working for yourself. So I hope that answers the question, but it basically applies to a sole trader rather than a company. Complaints policy you need as a company too, but if you're a sole trader working for an organisation, they may have a complaints policy, but if they have a complaint against you, then you would need to make sure you had a policy too. I'm still a student and have started to help a charity produce educational material about nutrition, just educational, not personalised advice. Is it likely that I need some kind of insurance for myself? We'll ask the charity about it, as I suppose it might depend. So yes, if the charity insurance covers you, then it's fine, but do ask the charity. Otherwise, regardless of whether it's educational information or personalised advice, it's still you providing nutrition information, so it would still need the professional liability insurance. The fact you're a student, I would suggest you also speak to your lecturers, because it may be that the insurance that they have as a university could cover placements. So check with your lecturers as well. Lots of great questions. It's lovely when you get lots of questions because it shows people are really engaged with the subject. So I'll give you another 30 seconds in case there are any other questions. That's all. So we put in the, sorry, just going to check we've got all the links in the chat. So the links are going to come in the chat in a moment. Any other questions?
Hi,
So
Aliya. Thank you
safeguarding
for-
training, have a time limit. I don't know the answer to that question in terms of a time limit. I regularly do safeguarding training every 3 years on the voluntary roles that I have. So yeah, that's a good question. We need to find that out. Yeah, Lynn said every 3 years is how she does it. I think that would probably be, I mean, safeguarding, there's some bits of safeguarding that don't change, but then the procedures may be different depending on who you do the training with. So that's why it needs to be updated. Within scouting it is, and scouting usually does things very thoroughly in terms of safeguarding. So just another question, if you're a sole trader, how would a complaints procedure work? Who would assess the complaint? So if you want to look at my complaints procedure, it's on my website. Essentially, you assess the complaint. You can have a next level where you get another registered nutritionist to assess the complaint, and then it can go to AfN, would be the kind of 3 levels. But you can do that whichever way you think is helpful, as long as you make sure you've got the complaints policy. That's the crucial thing. So the links are in the chat now for the link to the other services on the website, the evaluation link, and the award link. And no pressure to vote for the award. I'm not saying that, but I have put it as a shameless plug. So I hope you found that helpful. If you've got any questions that you want to pop in the evaluation link, then I will get back to you on those. And I hope you have a really good evening after this.